Lizzie. Today we're going to talk about the phrase, Catholicism has not changed. I hear quite a few people saying this who are Catholic, and they specifically say Catholicism hasn't changed to non-Catholics as a way to convert them into Catholicism. So first I want to talk about the half-truth within the statement, Catholicism has not changed. The reason people think this is that Catholicism's claim is that Catholic theology can be traced back to the early church, to the Bible, to Christian beliefs in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Catholicism believes that the Catholic Church is the original church founded by Jesus. That the theology of the early church is still the theology we're teaching today. That the sacraments in the early church and in the Bible are still sacraments in Catholicism today. All of this can be true, but that doesn't mean that Catholicism has not changed. The statement Catholicism has not changed as just a broad blanket statement is wrong. And when Protestants who are very informed on church history hear Catholics say that, it makes them not want to be Catholic because it makes Catholics look like they're very ignorant in a lot of church history. So some examples of how Catholicism has changed. A lot of aspects of Mass that have gone on for centuries were not there originally. The way the priests wear vestments, that was not original. Also, the type of church art we see, whether that is icons, stained glass, crucifix, statues. Yes, there was art in the early church, but it looked a lot different than the typical Catholic art we see today. Even things like the sign of the cross was a development. The more original sign of the cross was thought to be on the forehead, and even the Nicene Creed was a development. Originally, the Apostles' Creed, which is the one we say during the Rosary, was used at baptisms when people were converting into Catholicism. They would say the Apostles' Creed, and then that became the Nicene Creed, and then there was the next version of the Nicene Creed with the Filioque, which the Orthodox Church did not like, and that, along with many, many other things, led to the split between the Orthodox and Catholic Church. So much of the exterior of the sacraments was not there in the early church. The intrinsic truth and core meaning of the sacraments was there originally, and we can see the sacraments in the Bible in the early church. There's a lot of aspects of it that today look a lot different than how it was. One example is how confession is one-on-one with just the priest and one person. That has existed for so long, but originally they had group confession in the early church. That doesn't mean that the sacrament of confession we have today was completely made up. It was connected to the group confession, and we can see in John chapter 20, 21 to 23, that Jesus is conferring the power of the apostles and future priests to forgive sins. That is original in the Bible, and then that's connected to the group confession and connected to the one-on-one confession. Another thing that has changed is the sacrament of the Eucharist. So the early Christians believed that the Eucharist was the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. We see that in the early Christian writings. We see that in John 6 and in the communion accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Clearly, the real presence of the Eucharist is original. This belief has existed since early Christianity. But the exact words used to consecrate the Eucharist has changed through the years. A lot of Christians who attend Latin Mass kind of have this ideology that that Mass goes back so far, but even in the Middle Ages, there were multiple types of Latin Mass, and in the early church, the liturgies were different depending on where you were in the Christian world. And the Orthodox Church can do the same thing because, yes, they've been doing the St. John Chrysostom Divine Liturgy for over 1,000 years. It is a few centuries into Christianity until the St. John Chrysostom liturgy was created. And so in the early church, before there was Latin Mass, before there was Chrysostom's Divine Liturgy, there was Mass going on in different languages depending on where you were. Just because the liturgy, the Eucharist, looked different depending on the century, depending on the country, that does not mean that the theology of the Eucharist, being the physical body and blood of Christ, did not exist originally. Clearly, we see it in the Bible, we see it in 1st, 2nd, 3rd century Christian writings, this belief in the Eucharist, and we still have the sacrament of the Eucharist today, 2,000 years later, but the way it's looked through the years is different. Another thing I really want to talk about is the role of the Pope. This is something where the Orthodox Church and Catholicism disagrees on, because the Orthodox Church thinks the role of the Pope should be smaller and different than how it looks today. The role of the Pope has grown and changed and developed so much, but there are core intrinsic parts of being the Pope that have existed in the role of the Roman bishop from the early church. We can see in St. Ignatius of Antioch's writing, Pope Clement's writings in the end of the 1st century, very beginning of the 2nd century. We can see the role of the Pope in the baptism and Easter controversies of the early church. We see the role of the Pope. And so a lot of aspects of the office of the Pope today are not necessary. We could get rid of a lot of the stuff. We can make the Pope's role a lot smaller, and we would still have the intrinsic theology of the role of the Roman bishop. There's even a word to distinguish these two different things. So there is Catholic dogma and Catholic doctrines, which are on moral and theological topics and cannot change. And then there are Catholic disciplines, which are things that can change through the years that the Pope and the bishops have the power to change. And an example of that is priestly celibacy. Throughout church history, there have been times where priests have been married. Some of the apostles are married. We still do have some married priests in Catholicism today in the Eastern rites, but mostly priests are celibate. And that's something that the Pope and bishops, if they wanted to, they could change. That's just a discipline. Another example of church discipline that can change are fasting rules. Currently, the Catholic Church has watered down the rules surrounding fasting during Lent and Advent. There isn't any official fasting during Advent, and the Lent fasts, I think, are very minimal, and I think it could be a lot better. And so that's something where if the Pope and bishops want to implement more fasting, they can. That's a discipline. There are so many exterior aspects of Catholicism that change through the years, but ultimately the core theology, the Catholic dogma, has stayed the same and is guarded by our church magisterium. Do not say Catholicism has never changed. Be careful how you talk. If you're the only Catholic that has ever talked to this Protestant and they're informed on church history, it could really push them away from wanting to become Catholic. I love you guys so much, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!